Welcome to Archaeodeath, Death and Memory from Past to Present, an exploration of the archaeology of mortality by Professor Howard Williams. Welcome to my talk as part of the Chester Heritage Festival. I'm Professor Howard Williams of the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Chester, and I'm delighted to be able to speak to you on the topic of After Rome, Chester and the Dark Ages. And I'm recording this talk for my Archaeodeath YouTube channel, so if you know anybody that would like to hear it but couldn't make it today, then they can follow along on Archaeodeath on YouTube. Subscribe now for free information. Feel free to turn your mics off and your videos off as you prefer, and hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. If any questions come to you, do pop them in the chat as we go along, and I will try and answer them at the very end. What I'm going to try and do is a first for me, because while I've had the privilege and pleasure, or at least most of the time it's been a privilege and pleasure, to live near Chester and to work at the university here in Chester, I have never presented beyond occasional talks to students and occasional walks with students. I've never presented about the archaeology of Chester itself. So while I'm hardly new to the city of Chester and hardly new to the early Middle Ages and its archaeology and history, I have never before presented on Chester's early medieval archaeology. So this is a bit of an experiment for me, and I sort of balance nervously on the shoulders of giants in doing so, because Chester has not only got a rich and important history going back over 2,000 years, but it also has a long tradition of archaeological inquiry and decades of archaeological research in terms of investigations and syntheses. And I wanted to point out with just this image before I start that almost nothing of what I say is my work. This is all just sort of pulling together some thoughts and reflections on the work of others. And in doing so, I probably get a lot of it wrong, or probably miss a lot of key and crucial points. And I want to emphasize, therefore, that this is a work in progress, as well as a first experiment in talking about Chester's early Middle Ages. This is the structure of my talk, which I think will be over in about 45 minutes, or if you can stay awake that long. And I will be starting off by talking about the end of Roman Chester. I will then jump about 450 to 500 years to the Viking Age. And then I will go back to the Dark Ages, back to the 5th to 9th centuries. I will then present some reflections on Chester's Dark Age heritage, and I will also then reflect at the end to conclude on a future for the Dark Ages. So my talk is going to be about looking at what people have been saying about the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages. No one actually talks about the Dark Ages in scholarship. We talk about the early Middle Ages, but I use Dark Ages here as simply a popular term to introduce to people the period of time, but also mainly to annoy my colleagues who have a particular sort of reflex every time the phrase Dark Ages hoves into view in any kind of discussion. So it's really just to troll my academic colleagues by using the term Dark Ages as much as anything else. We have to have our fun, don't we? So I'm going to proceed with part one, the end of Roman Chester. Now, Chester is known as a modern city and in heritage terms as a Roman city, but the region and the area after the end of the official participation, shall we say, of northwestern and England and northeast Wales in as being part of the Roman province of Britannia is less poorly understood and poorly engaged with on a popular level. We know that by the time of Domesday Book, the region was sparsely populated and not particularly productive in terms of agricultural land, but that it did have extensive resources of woodland, mineral resources, including lead and salt. It had an important mercantile importance. It was a key node of trade routes, both on land and via rivers and via the Irish Sea. And I would like to characterize it, and this is a bit of a mouthful, but I think it is a helpful way of framing it. It's not necessarily the most populous or rich or significant place in itself, but this Chester and its environment in the 5th to 11th centuries in broad terms can be understood as a shifting, multi-scalar and multi-axial frontier zone. Ooh, that sounds complicated. But what I mean by that is simply that it's a bit of nothing and a bit of everything. And it was really important for multiple kingdoms and multiple communities, not only as a place where people continue to live in, but as a connection point, a zone of interaction between different zones operating at different scales, and not simply north south, east west, or northwest southeast, but on multiple planes. That's the way I like to think of this region. And that because of that, the Chester region in the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages is all about cultural hybridities on linguistic, political, and ethnic terms. Now, the usual way we break down the early Middle Ages in the story of Chester between the end of Rome and the Norman conquest is to talk about a late Roman or sub-Roman phase of the 4th and early 5th centuries, then talk about what some people call a Powysian Chester, the late 5th to early 7th century, where Chester may have come under the orbit of an emerging set of polities, including the early medieval kingdom of Powys. Then we talk about Mercian Chester, where Chester became under the influence of the western frontiers of the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia in the later 7th to late 9th centuries. And then in the traditional story of Chester, we go into the time of the West Saxon early burh, founded in AD 907 and up to around 980. And then we talk about a later burh after a Viking raid of 980 right up to 1066, the traditional end of the early Middle Ages, although it didn't end overnight, but that's sort of the end of the English Anglo-Saxon kingdom and its replacement by a new political regime of William the Conqueror. This is therefore seen as the sort of last phase, where Chester is perhaps not as important as it had been in the early mid-10th century, but still an important trading centre and so on. And so that's the traditional story. And the story is therefore emphasising that there was no single Dark Age for Chester. There was no single early Middle Ages. There was a sequence of events. And the standard story is that while we may not know exactly what's going on in Chester and around Chester at any one point, that Chester never went away fully. That Chester trickled on after the end of the formal end of the Roman province and the breakup and fragmentation in political and social and economic terms of the Roman Western Empire. But beyond that, there's still a lot of contention. Now, the first thing is I've done a quick survey of all of the literature on late Roman Britain, and I found strikingly that, to my mind, Chester doesn't feature prominently in any of it. And sometimes in some of the most recent books on the end of Roman Britain and late Roman towns in particular, Chester isn't mentioned at all. And I've done, with the beauty of PDFs and Google searches, you can search through with Chester and it brings up Winchester and Silchester and Manchester and lots of other Chesters. But Chester itself, still, despite all this archaeological work that's been done, particularly the work since the 1970s, it often gets overlooked in discussions of late Roman urbanism and Roman archaeology more generally about the end. And so we are still reliant on David Mason's very helpful 2007 book, and it remains the only synthesis of note to comprehensively look at the end of Roman Chester. This was obviously a fortress status, but the fate of the legion remained sketchy, particularly into the 4th century. We have evidence of refurbishment in the early 4th century of some of the key public buildings. We have evidence that some of the barracks were still being occupied in some form through to the middle of the 4th century. Evidence of the rebuilding of the fortress walls in the 4th century suggests there was still a civic identity of both reflecting some of the public buildings and in terms of the mural identity. And we also have evidence of the elliptical building and fortress bars having modifications through into the late 4th century. And indeed, David Mason's synthesis suggests there was occupation down perhaps into the 5th century and possibly through to the end of the 5th century in some of the buildings in the centre of the city. Now, exactly confirming that and in detail is not clear in his synthesis, but there's an aspiration, there's a drive by scholars like Mason to see the city continuing in some form into the 5th century. And we have evidence we'll come back to that perhaps the amphitheatre was repurposed in the 4th century and may have had an afterlife in the 5th century too. So we have a lot of archaeological work done in and around the city is finding hints of a continued active centre in the 4th century and hints of some possible 5th century activity, although the scale and character of it is still open to debate. And indeed, there is some discussions of whether there may have been a broader, Chester can be understood as part of a broader Iristy in northern British, sort of late Roman militarised zone, becoming transformed in the 4th and into the early 5th century. There's no single moment where the Roman army disappeared, but a transformation of this Roman province into more localised warlords and petty sort of local scale leaders who are still operating using some of the Roman infrastructure. One of the key ideas that we've seen operating in the archaeology of discussions of David Mason is whether there was an Episcopal focus for a Christian community in the 4th and perhaps even into the early 5th centuries. And evidence of salt pans at Shavington near Crewe with this inscription has been used. A lot of emphasis has gone on this to suggest that in the late Roman period there would have been a Christian bishop and that they may have still had an ecclesiastical control over Chester and its region for some duration into the 5th century and beyond. We do have some late coins, despite the dropping numbers of coinage being used, and we do have evidence of some late defended rural settlements, and we have evidence of late reorganisation and blocking of some of the entrances of the amphitheatre. So all of this is hints of a continued activity through the 4th and into the early 5th century at Chester, but still a lot of different emphases by different authors on exactly what's happening and for how long in the 5th century. But no scholar that I can find is arguing for a demonstrable evidence of a sustained civic identity and community, a populace continuing through the 5th century and beyond. So like with many Roman towns, we seem to have different authors and different scholars trying to emphasize different scales of survival and degrees of decline, but a decline and eventual abandonment of the city does seem to be taking place in the 5th century of a different, the timescale of which is unclear. So we don't see a continuation of Chester as a urban centre beyond the 5th century, and perhaps even by the middle of the 5th century it was already gone out of play. Let's now skip a few hundred years to the Viking Age, because if Chester is understood popularly as a Roman city that declines and falls in the 5th century, perhaps as a secondary identity, it is understood as associated with the Viking Age, the time of the Viking world, and these new mercantile connections, these new raids and reconfigurations of politics and economy in the late 9th and 10th centuries. And this is where a new story for Chester can be told, where from the historical source telling us that a burh, a fortified centre, is established in AD 907, we can pick up the story with more confidence again in the early 10th century. That this is a narrative built from the work of Alan Thacker, David Griffith, David Mason and Simon Ward and others, who have built up the story from the archaeological evidence and historical sources. Part of the backstory is of Hiberno-Norse settlers leaving Dublin and perhaps establishing themselves on either side of the Dee estuary, particularly on Wirral, but also in northeast Wales. The burh being established as the way I describe a burh, as a fortified multifunctional urban site with a harbour and a mint. That we have evidence at Lower Bridge Street of settlement and manufacturing evidence, Perhaps at this time, Ethelfled, the lady of the Mercians, may have translated the cult of St. Werburgh from Hanbury to Chester to consolidate and either establish the church that's going to become the abbey and later cathedral of St. Werburgh's, or reformulating it with the new dedication and association with St. Werburgh. That St. Peter's at the Cross may be re-established as a church, and perhaps, although there's no archaeological evidence of that, and from the dedications alone, the churches of St. Olaf and St. Bridget may have 10th, 11th century origins. And there are probably other churches starting at this period too, as part of this new burgal infrastructure. So, and it's the fortifications of the burh that have been identified, if not convincingly and fully dated, such as here in a section in St. John Street from 1989, showing the collapsed Roman rubble of the Roman wall being built over by a bank and a ditch with a steep ankle breaker ditches postulated originally, and postulated again, we can't be sure, a palisade on top of the bank. As with other linear earthworks, we can't be sure of that, but that's pretty a likely arrangement. So the refortification of the original Roman fortress, but the extension of those fortresses out to the river in two locations. So this is part of a story that Chester comes back into the light of history, so to speak, to use those light dark phrases, in the early 10th century as a burh, part of a chain of fortified military, administrative, economic and political centres that were consolidating proxy Mercian West Saxon control over this borderland territory that had previously been a borderland of different sorts, which we'll come back to, with Chester and others either identified or postulated. And you'll notice, you'll be aware that Runcorn is perhaps the most famous of these now because of its featuring in The Last Kingdom TV show based on Bernard Cornwell's books. So actually Runcorn may now be more famous as a burh, even though the evidence for the burh at Runcorn is far less than there is for Chester. But, you know, just to flag that up, that popular culture takes over the story here. And we have Runcorn as part of this picture, but also the latest one at Rhuddlan or Clydymutha on the Clwyd. So we have this chain of fortified centres mimicking and adapting and extending the West Saxon strategy of landscape defence, civil defence and administration into this region, right? And we have archaeological evidence of that from Lower Bridge Street with these rock-cut cellared buildings of 10th century date that have been, this is the evidence and this is the artist's reconstruction. We've got the wonderful sculpture within St. John's. Here's St. John's 1-6, fragments of grave slabs. These are probably grave markers of the 10th or early 11th century. These ring-headed crosses. And here's some more. And although Mason, misleadingly, and I have to emphasize this because it is still widely being read as a 9th century piece of sculpture, Professor Richard Bailey and other scholars would confirm this is also a 10th century piece, said to be from St. Werburgh's, but actually probably also from St. John's originally, but we can't be sure. In other words, we have sculpture that is likely to be from St. John's Priory that dates to this period, before the collegiate church of the 12th century. You know, we've got this evidence of the late 11th and 12th century. We've got this evidence of an Anglo-Scandinavian or Hiberno-Norse or, you know, Mercian, if you like, Mercian West Saxon, whatever the descriptor you want to add to it, this burgal identity through its settlement evidence and also sculptural evidence. We've also got hoard evidence. We've got silver hoards such as the Castle Esplanade hoard, buried in about AD 970, with ingots and various other elements, coins and so on. We have evidence of a prolific Chester mint of silver coinage in the 10th century. And so the picture we gain is of a late Roman fortress and city that declines and falls in the 5th century and then is picked back up in the early 10th century as a major trading, administrative and political centre. And so here's, I think this is from Simon Ward, or it could be from one of a number of books by leading scholars who've worked on Chester and its burh. You can see here the postulated extension of the burh walls down to the Dee on the northwest from the Roman fortifications, the reconsolidation of the Roman encirclement, and then the postulated you know, extension of the burh down to the river by the amphitheatre, just west of the amphitheatre by Redcliffe. So we have this idea, this concept that the inside of the Roman fortress is being resettled in the 10th and early 11th century. Lower Bridge Street down to the old Roman bridge is being it has industrial and mercantile activity and settlement. St John's is being a major focus of ecclesiastical activity, as well as St Werburgh and St Peter's. And there is also perhaps possible evidence of late Saxon or 10th, 11th century evidence up by the North Gate, by Abbey Green, and possibly out by Foregate Street. So, you know, hardly a populous city in Roman terms, but in regards to understanding 10th, 11th century urbanism, this is as good as you're going to get in anywhere across northwestern Europe, from places outside of places like, you know, wow, there's some qualifiers to that, but outside of places like Lincoln, York, Winchester, you know, the kind of archaeological evidence you'd expect to find, it's all here really. So far I've presented you with a story of Roman decline and fall, and then 4.5, 5 centuries later, a settlement rising up. And this is the wonderful artist's reconstruction of how the city may have looked in the early to mid 10th century, where a church built at the site of St Werburgh's, the gates perhaps still being established, and some of the Roman fortifications being extended to the northwest, extended to the southeast. Perhaps there's St John's and settlement to an established Roman bridge, a continued Roman bridge, and a harbour by Lower Bridge Street. That's been the established picture. I mean, obviously, you can pick holes in any artist's reconstruction, but I think this wonderfully gives you a sense of that inheritance of Roman fortifications, Roman ruins, but still as an active influence on the street plan, with some qualifications such as Northgate Street obviously having to run around some of the Roman ruins, some of the Roman streets still surviving along the lines of where they had been, others being cut through the rubble again and ruin, and people market gardening and within the spaces of which had been Roman barrack blocks and baths and the main sort of central parts of the Roman city, but also churches, settlement, and so on, but also outside the line of the wall, what had been the civilian settlement of the Roman city, also receiving evidence of 10th, 11th century activity. So this is a really sort of confirmed picture, well, as confirmed as anything in the early Middle Ages can be. Having said that, having built that up as a pretty solid picture of a late Saxon burh, there remain a lot of debates. For example, two eminent archaeologists, David Stock and Paul Emerson, have recently come up with a different take on the late Saxon city, the burh, and they've postulated some qualifiers to that established picture, particularly querying whether they concede that there would have been a lot of that activity going on, but they really try to rethink how we understand the importance of St John's and its relationship with the Roman amphitheatre. And they talk about it as a mercantile urban locale with both secular and ecclesiastical foci linked to a market or assembly, perhaps in reusing the amphitheatre, and linked to a strand, a beach, sort of a harbour up beyond the line of the former Roman bridge. And in doing so, they query the early foundation date of St John's, which has been put by a lot of scholars at 689, because that's based on very late sources, post-conquest sources, and query its association with martyrs and the story of martyrs, and they query the Roman bridge survival. And they suggest that before the building of the late medieval bridge and its weir, that this may have been a natural bar that only boats could cross at high tide, that would perhaps have made this a very important, controllable, manageable and defensible, secure strand for a harbour, safe from raiders, or at least partially safe from raiders at low tide, from the pool and lower stretches of the estuary. So they also emphasise the importance of the Dee gorge, as they describe it, the lowest part of the Dee, where the Dee is constrained by the natural rock before it spills out into this broader ruddy spread. And they emphasised, given the Minerva shrine and presence there, as this may have been a long-term numinous place, a place of sacred qualities, as a place of significant tidal interaction, and a place of cult that may predate the Roman period and is continued to be reflected in the Roman city. So, but they don't really take that much forward, but they do say that St. John's therefore may have been at a very ancient pre-Christian holy site that becomes a very significant location for not only trade and exchange, but for a sort of sense of sacred landscape in the 10th and 11th centuries. Now, the problem, and they expound on this idea and talk about the significance of the Dee in the rowing of Edgar, King Edgar the Peaceable, on the Dee, in the famous account that the kings of Britain come together at Chester to meet King Edgar, who arrives by ship with his navy and is rowed to St. John's Church on the Dee. And that's really interesting, but they have problems because they're trying to transpose a model for understanding Chester in the 10th and 11th century that really comes from Eastern England. That comes from Thetford, Norwich, Lincoln, and one could query whether that's fully applicable to the Irish Sea zone. They also insist on identifying a single location of St. John's being absolutely crucial, whereas all that archaeological evidence from within the city itself, they really downplay, and all the archaeology done by David Mason, Simon Ward and their teams and others, they don't really talk about that at all. So they insist on talking about the importance of St. John's and its sculpture, but don't seem to forget the rest of the activity we have. And even they downplay the lower Bridge Street evidence of mercantile activity. And what they don't really do is tackle the earlier origins, because if Chester's St. John's Church is only coming to be established in the 10th century, well, was it there before? And they say, well, it could have been, but we can't know for sure. So they don't really address what happens from the end of the Roman town up to this 11th and 10th century phase. So if St. John's had been such a numinous place and this was such a sacred landscape, where is the evidence for it of how the site was important in that period? So what I've done so far is tell you about the Roman city declining and the different debates about how we interpret the archaeology of the 10th and early 11th centuries. But in part 3, I want to go back to this period from the 5th to 9th centuries. And was there anything significant going on in Chester in those centuries? Or was it really a dark age in which everything just broke apart and there was no significance to Chester at all? And this is a really interesting question, because so many authors have, shall we say, using modern parlance, reached far to make Chester significant in this period. That it must be significant. It was such an important Roman legionary fortress and city. It becomes important again in the 10th and 11th century. Surely it must be a significant place in the 5th to 9th centuries. And some authors will do almost anything to make it so. And others are more than happy to just say, no, it wasn't important in this period at all. And so, as usual, I'm a bit wishy-washy. I'm going to go for a middle course between those two. But I do just want to point out that there's no reason why Chester has to stay important. And there's also no reason why we should insist, just because the evidence is more difficult to see, that nothing was going on here. We have to try and negotiate very difficult, limited historical sources and very fragmented archaeological evidence to try and say something of these centuries. But it's difficult to do so, because in the 5th to 7th centuries, some scholars have made the assertion, including Simon Ward in his book, that this was Chester was in the orbit of the kingdom of Powys. But actually, we don't have much evidence that Powys even existed as a kingdom before the end of this period, before the 7th century and perhaps even the 8th century. Some people have argued, well, the early Old English name of the Wreoconsete, which we have from the 7th century, could this be a territory of an early English or early Anglo-Saxon territorial group, or a group blended between British and Saxons? And again, that would pick up on the idea that the pre-Roman tribe of the Cornovi continue to have some significance in its territorial organisation after the breakup of the Roman province, perhaps focused on Wreoconsete and north towards the Dee and Chester, but we can't even know that. We have a hint that there was a sense of Chester having a place name that was recognised by Britons and the English, as David Mason makes a point, and we have the possibility of a synod happening at Chester, but really, we don't even know if Chester is the place where that synod took place. The recent study, Fafinski does make the argument that this site may have been really significant for the early British Church because it drew on the Roman past. And I think that's a really powerful idea, but we've got to find some evidence to back that up. We have the idea that circulated a lot that Eccleston, just south of Chester, may have been an important ecclesiastical sub-Roman Christian site, but there's a whole series of questions about how we interpret that place name, and no real archaeological evidence to back up it was there as a 5th, 6th century church site just because it's got a circular churchyard. That's a whole real nest of problems there of assuming an early Christian site just because of a circular churchyard and an eccles place name. Then we have the association with Bangor on Dee, which by the early 7th century is seen as an important British monastery, but that doesn't necessarily mean there was anything happening in Chester itself. And we have the Battle of Chester, which we know is happening somewhere near Chester in the early 7th century. The date 616 is often bandied around. The Heronbridge site has been evoked by David Mason as evidence for that battle, but I think there's still a lot of questions about the dating and the publication of those results to confirm that we are looking at the war dead of that one historically recorded event. Fafinski has recently argued that, well, Chester was still an important ecclesiastical territorium like those he identifies in late antique Gaul, with the continuity taking place of the salt trade based on that earlier evidence of the 4th century that we have, but he doesn't really present any evidence to back that up. And if you hadn't guessed, where I'm going with this is that while many archaeologists, including David Mason, have postulated stone building, occupation of the dark earth, and various possible timber structures of 5th, 6th century date within the legionary fortress, I've yet to see a full coherent presentation of that evidence, of convincing evidence of a sustained activity through the 5th, 6th, and into the early 7th century in Chester. There's evidence of cultivation, and that's really interesting, including and ploughing in the lower Bridge Street area, suggesting that this area was still occupied. No one's saying it's being deserted. People are still living in and around the city, but that's not the same thing as presuming civic ecclesiastical functions persisting. And we have the Wreoconsete debate problem, and this is the debate focusing on the site of Wreoconsete, where between the catastrophists and the continuators, how do we understand these traces of latest and later activity on Roman sites? And the problem with Wreoconsete that was presented by Philip Barker and Roger White has been contested recently by Alan Lane, making the point that there's a lot of fragmentary evidence, it's difficult to identify the structures, and there's very little diagnostic 5th to 7th century artifacts in the city of Wreoconsete. So we have the same problem with Chester. It doesn't mean that no one lived here, and it doesn't mean that people just went away. The site may have been one of a series of regionally significant locations, but we can't presume we know exactly what was happening here. And the same challenges arise when we're thinking about the Mercian kingdom expanding in the 7th and the 8th to 9th centuries. And this is a map I've stolen from an article by my colleague Dr. Morn Kappa, which shows sort of this borderland territory, the western frontier of Mercia. And David Mason says in this period, Chester was probably an ecclesiastical centre. Now, is this the same ecclesiastical centre that people like Fafinski are arguing is continuing into the 5th, 7th century? Is this St. John's because it's got this late argument being made for a 7th century foundation date? We've got evidence of some roasting pits and sunken feature buildings in Lower Bridge Street, but how much earlier than the burh, how much earlier than the early 10th century those are, it's not too clear. I mean, they may be very late 9th century. There's been arguments for a Middle Anglo-Saxon settlement around St. John's because of this early foundation date, and that would match with many other wick sites we find, Middle Anglo-Saxon wick sites that we find across lowland Britain. But the evidence is still really lacking. The sculpture is all late Saxon, not Middle Saxon. And we've got this Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reference to the city being deserted in 894. And while that doesn't tell us anything either way, because abandoned may be a rhetorical device or a simplification of a more complex phenomenon. We don't have the categorical evidence of a vibrant trading centre with ecclesiastical centre that some are willing to push into this 7th to 9th century period. We've got the arguments that maybe the amphitheatre was being repurposed as a fortress or as a part of an early phase of St John's. But again, and we've got this new evidence of a ditch from the excavations at Grosvenor Park. And I haven't seen the full radiocarbon dates for that yet, but there may be evidence of a broader fortified enclosure associated with St John's, but we don't know whether that's in the 10th, 11th century or earlier. So again, what I'm telling you is that I don't get a clear picture of what's going on in the 5th to 9th century at all, and that much of this evidence can be pushed earlier or pushed later, or indeed discounted entirely as evidence of a civic, organised centre of any kind, beyond perhaps some fragments of ongoing occupation, which I don't doubt. There's people living in and around the city. So Keith Fitzpatrick-Matthews has done some inspiring work trying to interpret the amphitheatre as a high status dwelling and church, with various post holes, possibly indicating timber halls, and are using the parallel of Arles to argue that maybe a masonry structure was built from the eastern gateway, perhaps as a fortified refuge or assembly place. And Fafinsky has recently taken this forward as gospel and suggested this is the way it should be interpreted. But frankly, there's still a lot of different ways we can interpret this evidence. And we are still awaiting the publication of the post-Roman archaeology from the amphitheatre. So I don't want to dismiss it, but equally I don't think we can take this much further until we've got this evidence fully presented in a more coherent form. So that leaves us in a bit of a quandary. So what am I suggesting? I'm not saying people abandon this area, but I'm also saying that there is still a bit of a Dark Age vibe going on here. Apparently, it's almost a heresy in archaeology to talk about Dark Age, to talk about a time when we find it difficult to talk about this period. But I'm afraid some of the attempts to write a history for this period have long been pseudo-archaeology, have long been fantastical. And I think the attempts to conjure a continuity for Chester does border on the fantastical. We are, to use a Dad's Army phrase, we're entering the realms of fantasy with some of these reconstructions. And I think we do have to, I'm not dismissing them, but I'm saying we have to be quite cautious in saying what's going on. What I would say, though, is that the broader region, the locality, the environs of Chester was clearly strategically important in this period, even if it wasn't a major conurbation or centre. And that is demonstrated by the great linear earthworks, the dykes of Watts Dyke and Offers Dyke, here shown Offers Dyke in purple, Watts Dyke in a kind of greeny, yellowy, sickly colour. And this is from an article I published late last year, talking about this multi-scalar, multi-axial frontier zone created by these linear earthworks based on the river systems of the Dee and the Severn, and particularly where both operated together. And there's still debates about the relative dating of these linear earthworks, which I won't get into here. I think we are looking at a hydraulic frontier zone linking the major rivers of Western Britain, the Dee and the Severn, and defending it with these linear frontiers. And these frontiers may have been multifunctional. They may have been military. They may have been about controlling trade and exchange, as well as having a territorial component. And there's debates about how we understand them. But in simple terms, these do not discount the significance of Chester. These do support the continued strategic importance of this lower section of the Dee before it heads out into its estuary, and with its arteries of Roman roads and other routeways, as still an important key node in a frontier landscape. A frontier on multiple scales too. A frontier that was about Mercia facing off against Welsh rivals, but also against its Anglo-Saxon rivals of Wessex and Northumbria, but also to a wider Irish Sea world in a pre-Viking era. And that's something I've been pushing. Sort of David Griffith and others have rightly been talking about the importance of the Irish Sea zone in the Viking Age, but I think we can talk about this zone in the Mercian era of the 7th to 9th century, and the dykes do, I think, all about controlling that and projecting that Mercian power to the west. And in that regard, Chester was clearly significant. We just don't know how significant and what exactly was going on there in the 8th and 9th centuries in particular. So what I'm saying is there still a dark age for Chester in the 5th to 9th centuries? Yes. We still don't know much about what's going on, and if you don't find that uncomfortable, then good, because I think, as I said, some of the attempts to push a coherent picture of Fifinsky arguing that the church is still controlling this region with a bishopric through the 5th, 6th and 7th century, with Keith Fitzpatrick-Matthews arguing for a fortified amphitheatre perhaps. Yes, these are really cool ideas, but they're really not demonstrable yet. And I think we have to still accept that this is a really murky, if not dark, definitely a bit opaque period of time in Chester's history. We shouldn't presume a late antique British Powysian ecclesiastical continuity. We cannot import a Mercian model from Eastern England of minsters and wicks, and but we perhaps best think about it as a persistent place within a complex and fluid frontier zone. And there I concur with my colleague, again previously mentioned, Dr. Maureen Capper, in her article about St Guthlac, where she talks about the Western Mercian frontier zone, its relationship with the British kingdoms, and does see it in these terms as a fluid frontier, and Chester sits within that zone. And I think that's the best way, the only way we can really approach this this period, and understand how Chester may have been still significant as a ruinous place with occasional activity, but we can't really pin down it having a central place functions yet, from the archaeology I've been able to understand from it. And that leads us to my heritage dimension, which I talk about in a video I prepared and some resources I put online to support this talk. Because if it's so difficult for us to understand as specialists, how do we expect the public to get a handle on this? Romans? Well, we can get a sense of Romans. They've got armour and a bit of wall and a bit of tile and stuff in the museum. Where do we get that sense of, where did the population in the 21st century get a sense of this early medieval Chester? And this is a bigger problem. I talked about this on an English Heritage podcast last year with Sue Greeny, Dr. Sue Greeny, now at the University of Exeter, but then of English Heritage, where I talk about how so many of the sites are accessible visited heritage sites, in Cadw sites, English heritage sites, are seen as Roman or later medieval. Rome continues to dominate our popular perceptions. Much work has been done to emphasise the Viking heritage with the work of, for example, Claire Downham, but we're neglecting understanding this pre-Viking early medieval archaeology in northwest England in terms of ancient monuments, landscape, heritage sites and museums, because it's very difficult to latch onto something that is demonstrably of this period exclusively. And perhaps part of the way is to try and think about this period as part of the biography of place. The Chester was never fully abandoned, but it was a time when we lack a coherent understanding of how and what was going on in and around it. I mean, to my knowledge, and I'm happy for people to add further insights on this because I'll always miss things, there's only one heritage interpretation panel outdoors that says anything about the early Middle Ages in Chester, and that's clearly inspired by the ideas of Keith Fitzpatrick-Matthews about the amphitheatre, and it's this Warlords and Martyrs board at the amphitheatre, suggesting that maybe there was a continued significance of the site up to the foundation of St John's in 689. There's the Viking period stone sculpture in St John's, but it's unlit, it's poorly displayed, there's no adequate interpretation. This has to be said, and I'm sure many would agree with me in the heritage community, a great shame that there's been no ability to move forward with improving the display of this material. I think that I look forward to hearing updates, but I think this is a real shame. I've talked about this on my blog from 2018. There was one, the Rue D cross, which is late medieval. It's not demonstrably early medieval, but I think it's represented here almost as if it's an early medieval cross. But it's on a piece of the heritage art put up as a waymarker around the city, right by the Rue D, the racecourse. But you can't actually see this image unless you are sort of half balanced out from the wall walk into over spiked railings into the University of Chester car park. So it's been positioned in a location we can't see it. You've got this wonderful piece of mosaic art, which I love, at King Edgar's Field and near the Minerva Shrine. But of course, this is a site dedicated and associated with Edgar and his rowing on the Dee in the 19th century as a piece of public park. There's nothing there linked to the early Middle Ages. And then I suppose from the town hall, you have this boy's own story, Victorian story of Chester's origins, in which you don't want to mention St Werburgh or St Ethelfled or Queen Ethelfled, they're women, but you've got they put Egbert in. So is Egbert uniting the kingdoms? There he is. You know, I mean, honestly, I mean, so this is what I'm trying to say is, in heritage terms, we're not even incorporating any of this archaeological work that has been done over the last 50, 60 years. We're still languishing in a Victorian, Edwardian narrative. And the same goes for the Christian heritage of the cathedral, St Werburgh's shrine, St Werburgh, St Sexburger and Ethelfled. You know, this kind of stained glass narrative of Saxon origins. It's still very Victorian. And we've got modern pop culture to face, where we have various stereotypes of the fate of the Roman Britain for us to contend with, from Vinland Saga, the anime, which was wonderful. I love it, where one of the key characters is Welsh. He's a Viking. But here he is. The Saxons destroyed the Romans. You know, that oblivion of the end of Roman Britain, through to The Last Kingdom and Vikings Valhalla TV shows, which show the Anglo-Saxons inheriting a completely operative Roman cities and London and elsewhere, with walls and tiled roofs. So we have competing fantasies and visions of what happened at the end of Roman Britain in our popular culture, from complete decimation and abandonment through to absolute continuity and continuance. Oh, this is The Last Kingdom's representation of the Welsh. The Welsh are Roman, and they all wear red cloaks. I think that's the idea, because all Romans had red cloaks. I think, and therefore the Welsh have red cloaks. Haldar has a Welsh has a red cloak. I think that was the costume designer's not logic in The Last Kingdom, and it's all nonsense. So either we have this idea of the Anglo-Saxons or the British being inheritors of Rome, or of inheriting a wasteland, a complete dislocation. And of course, either view is far from our more nuanced picture. So I just came up with this idea, and I shared it on YouTube, and I've adapted it now of perhaps a new way we could try to engage people in the story of Chester's Dark Age past, its early medieval past, by using a London tube map style, which is totally contrived and stylized, but at least it allows people to link together to the key locations where archaeologies happen. There's nothing to see on the surface that links to the story of the early Middle Ages, but there are things that were found beneath the surface, sites that have Roman archaeological remains, sites that have later medieval built heritage, but have an important part of the story of the early medieval centuries. And so that's why I did one for Chester itself, the Chester Dark Age tube map. And this is my adapted version, where, thanks to Peter, thank you, Peter, I know you're here somewhere, Peter Carrington gave me some additional suggestions, and I've tried my best, although there's still obviously gaps and extra finds and sites which I couldn't include, but to emphasize the number of sites within the city and its environs that do have something to say about the story of early medieval Chester, even if we can't be sure exactly what that story is yet. The Eccleston, Heron Bridge, Edgarsfield, the churches of St Bridget's and St Olaf, the hoard at the Esplanade, which I called Esplanade in Castle, just a sort of play on elephants in Castle, couldn't resist. The Rue D, which isn't demonstrably early medieval at all, but it could be. St John's Priory, the amphitheatre, the Grosvenor Park, and then the fortification. So I created 3 lines, 3 ways you can navigate the city and its environs and visit sites linked to the early medieval story. And I decided to, inspired by one I did, a tube map I did for Wattsdyke and Offansdyke earlier this year, I've jumped to a bigger scale, because I think part of the challenge is that we can't tell a story of Chester on its own. We have to look at a regional picture, a landscape view. And this is my Dark Age Borderlands tube map, because we have to get outside of the modern English-Welsh border. We have to think of this region in early medieval terms as incorporating parts of what are now Wales and what are now England. So this captures some of the key sites. So Pillar of Elizeg, yay! You know, you may have heard me talk about that before. Castell Dinas Bran, which is not demonstrably anything to do with the early Middle Ages. It's a late prehistoric fortification and a 13th century castle, but it's at a strategic location in the Vale of Llangollen. It may well have had an important function, through to Huxley, where a hoard was found of silver Viking age silver. Basingwork Abbey, which may have been a Mercian fortification before it was a Cistercian monastery. Mells, a beach site, a market site. You know, Overchurch, where we have one of the few pre-Viking pieces of stone sculpture with a runic inscription. So in other words, just to try and network in a stylized way that people are familiar with. No one's actually believing these are lines. There's no real tubes, although I'm now worried that someone will actually take this literally and try to think that they can get on an underground train here. But assuming people have a little bit more knowledge than that, they'll understand this is a stylization. And yet, of course, the lines of Offansdyke and Wattsdyke are physical lines in the landscape that link together locations. But for the others, these are notional lines, that the green line roughly following the D, and the purple line, the Wirral line, following up the spine of the Wirral Peninsula to key locations where there's stone sculpture and other archaeology. That this is a way to get people to think of not only the sites, but the links, the landscape, the network, to help us build a picture. Which is why I think this is perhaps a more profitable way of approaching the early medieval archaeology of the region than simply sites. Thinking of the lines, the links, the rivers, the routes, the linear earthworks. Or it's rubbish. It's up to you. Take it or leave it. But it's just an idea. Maybe someone will throw me a bit of cash and I can develop this as an online app, and then people will think it's nice if it's called. If you call something an app, then it must be good. And this leads me to my concluding point, really, if you're still here. Part 5, a future for the Dark Ages, a future for the early Middle Ages in this region. And this is where I get a bit theoretical, perhaps, but I just want to bash these ideas out because I think we should not give up. So much important archaeology is done, so many important valid ideas have been put forward, but we still need to build a bigger and more richer picture to understand these centuries. And we still don't have a fully synthesized story for Chester and its environments that is actively decolonised, to use a modern phrase, by which I mean has really worked through and deconstructed a lot of the pseudoarchaeologies and pseudoarchaeologies, pseudohistories, pseudoarchaeologies we face in dealing with this period. And there's not just one, there's so many, and I haven't even dealt with them all. We need to explicitly counter the Arthurian, the assumption that we have this Dark Age Arthurian period, this warlord period, as a separate thing that was different. Or indeed these pan-European late antique narratives that some scholars are trying to impose on Chester and its region. We have the pan-Celtic survival delusional perspectives and the racial Anglo-Saxonists, which I think is not as overt in Chester as it has been elsewhere, but the very perhaps fixation on the burh and the Lady of the Mercians is part of that nationalistic parable that we're telling through the archaeology that we need to counter. We have to get away from the presentism of being fixated with the modern English-Welsh border as meaning anything in this period. We need to focus, even perhaps the fixation with the West Saxon dynasty and the Vikings is itself a problem. And try and see this region, even in the 10th, 11th centuries, as more than simply about Scandinavian settlement and West Saxon dynastic and political expansion. We need to think about what we mean when we talk about frontiers and borderlands. Which borders, when, where, and between what? Because I think this region is a borderland and a frontier zone, but what it's a borderland between and where and when is happening in more complex ways than we might not think. We need to talk about the British, the Mercian, the Irish Sea, not just the English, the Saxon, when we're talking about early medieval Chester. Well, some people already have, but I'm just emphasising that's really important. And it's this hybridity of ideas, cultures and peoples in this frontier zone that both make it such a fascinating topic, but also difficult to pin down. We can't just see it as a western edge of Anglo-Saxon England. We can't just see it as an extension of early medieval Wales or the Viking world. These are sort of colonial and nationalistic constructs that don't really work for this region. And perhaps the hope is to look at the biography of place and think about the power of these ruins. It's not just about finding activity within these ruins, but the fact these ruins, as Strickland and others have discussed, they endured, they influenced the structure of later centuries. And Chester can be seen there perhaps as, I wouldn't go as far as Stocker and Everson and say a numinous place, a sacred place, but certainly a persistent place in which multiple reuses may have been performed in and as an aspect of social memory. It doesn't mean there was continuity of activity and institutions in Chester, but the people kept coming back to it. It was strategic in geographical terms, but perhaps the power of the ruins and the power of the stories associated with the place brought people back again and again for different reasons and for different roles. That gets us back to this wonderful reconstruction, which we can pick holes in the details of it. It may show us a snapshot of these ruins, but how the ruins of the Roman city may have only become, it may have been only coherent as a Roman city when it started to become abandoned, and those ruins had new stories added to them, new significances in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, the 8th, 9th centuries, and then in the 10th and 11th centuries and beyond. That there was no such thing as a Roman cultural continuity, or but there may have also been no single later reuse. That there may have been just lots of different stages in the power and enduring presence of this Roman persistent place. So there's my non-answer, but I hope that was fun. I hope you enjoyed that and gave you a sense of, yeah, it's not all hopeless. I don't want to speak of despair. We still have a lot to learn about these centuries, but there are ways of getting at it from the exciting work that's been done over the last 50 years, and hopefully we'll learn more in coming decades. Thank you very much.